The year is 1650. The place is a cramped street in the shadows of Palermo, Sicily, where the summer sun cannot reach. A woman dressed in expensive black silk walks quickly through the narrow alley, her face hidden beneath a dark veil. She is not here to buy bread or wine. She is here to buy her freedom. She stops at a door that looks like all the others. Worn wood, peeling paint, nothing remarkable. But she knows, everyone knows. This is the door where desperate women come when prayers have failed them. She knocks 3 times. The door opens just a crack, and a pair of sharp, intelligent eyes study her from the darkness within. A voice, older, calm, asks a single question. "What ails you, daughter?" The woman in the veil does not say what truly ails her. She does not speak of the bruises hidden beneath her fine dress. She does not mention the husband who beats her, who spends her dowry on mistresses, who has promised to kill her if she ever shames him with talk of divorce. Instead, she whispers the code that every woman in Palermo has learned to use. "My mother," she says, her voice barely audible. "She suffers terribly. I need something to ease her passing." The door opens wider. The woman inside is perhaps 60 years old, her face lined but still beautiful, her dark eyes filled with a knowing that seems ancient. This is Giulia Tofana, and she has heard this story before, hundreds of times before. Giulia steps aside and gestures for her visitor to enter. The room inside is dim, lit only by a few candles. The air smells of flowers and herbs, lavender, rose, something sweet and medicinal. On a small table sits a collection of delicate glass bottles, each one no bigger than a woman's hand. They are beautiful, these bottles, decorated with painted images of saints and angels. They look like they should contain holy water, or perhaps an expensive perfume for a lady's dressing table. But they do not contain perfume. Giulia picks up one of the bottles. It is labeled Manna di San Nicola, the manna of Saint Nicholas, a blessing from a saint. She hands it to the woman in the veil, and as she does, she speaks in a low, careful voice. 4 to 6 drops, she says, her eyes locked on her customer's face. No more. Mix it in his wine, his soup, whatever he drinks. It has no taste, no smell, no color. He will seem to fall ill naturally, a fever perhaps, or weakness of the heart. The doctors will see nothing unusual. They will call it God's will. The woman in the veil takes the bottle. Her hands are trembling, but not from fear, from relief, from hope. She places a heavy purse of coins on the table, more money than most families in Palermo see in a year. "How long?" she whispers. "Patience," Giulia replies. "Slow is safe. A few drops at a time, spread over weeks. He will waste away, and no one will suspect. But if you are too eager, if you give too much too fast, questions will be asked." The woman nods, clutches the bottle to her chest like a holy relic, and slips back out into the street, pulling her veil tight. She disappears into the crowd, one more shadow in a city full of secrets. Giulia Tofana watches her go, then closes the door. She returns to her table and sits, running her fingers over the remaining bottles. Each one is a key that unlocks the cage of a trapped woman, a key that ends the life of a tyrant, a key that, depending on who you ask, is either an instrument of justice or a weapon of murder. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark stories, these forgotten legends of women who fought back in a world that gave them no power, are worth remembering, if you believe that history's shadows deserve to be brought into the light, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support allows us to keep digging into the mysteries of the past. Tonight, we enter the perfume shop of death. We will trace the life of Giulia Tofana, from her origins in the criminal underworld of Sicily to her reign as the most successful poisoner in history. From the hundreds of men who fell to her invisible hand, to the network of women who protected her secret, to the trial that finally brought her empire of poison to an end. This is not just the story of a killer. It is the story of power, and the story of what happens when the powerless find a weapon. It is the story of justice, or perhaps revenge, hidden in a bottle of holy water. This is the story of the woman who killed 600 men with a drop. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand the woman who became the Poison Priestess, you must first understand where she came from. Giulia Tofana was not born into a world of silk and silver. She was born into a world of survival, where women had no voice, no rights, and no escape. She was born into a world where poison was sometimes the only power a woman could hold. Her story begins not with her own birth, but with her mother's life. Her mother's name was Tofana d'Adamo, and she was a legend in her own right, though not the kind of legend the church would celebrate. Tofana lived in Palermo, Sicily, in the late 1500s. Sicily was a place of extremes. It was a land of great beauty and terrible cruelty, where the rich lived in palaces and the poor starved in the streets. It was a place where the Catholic Church held absolute power, where a woman's place was in the home, and where a wife was considered the property of her husband. Divorce was not just forbidden, it was unthinkable. A woman married to a cruel man had only 3 choices: endure, run away, and be hunted as a criminal, or pray for her husband's death. Tofana d'Adamo offered a 4th choice. She was a widow, a woman who had survived her own husband, though the circumstances of his death were, shall we say, convenient. After his passing, she did not remarry. Instead, she began to practice the old arts. She was a healer, the neighbors said. She knew herbs and remedies, the ancient knowledge passed from grandmother to daughter for generations. Women came to her with ailments, headaches, women's troubles, sleeplessness. But some women came to her with a different kind of ailment, an ailment that walked on 2 legs and came home drunk every night. Tofana would listen to their stories with sympathy. Then, quietly, she would give them a small vial of liquid, clear as water, odorless, tasteless. She never said what it was. She never had to. The women understood, and within weeks, sometimes months, their husbands would fall mysteriously ill. Fevers, weakness, a slow, wasting death that looked like any other illness in a time when medicine was primitive and death was common. For years, Tofana practiced her dark trade. She was careful, she was patient, and she was protected, not by walls or guards, but by a conspiracy of silence. The women who used her poison never spoke of it, not to priests, not to authorities, not even to each other in daylight. It was a secret shared only in whispers, in darkened rooms, between desperate souls. But all secrets, no matter how well kept, eventually find their way into the light. In 1633, Tofana d'Adamo was arrested. Perhaps someone's conscience finally broke. Perhaps a dying man confessed to a priest that his wife had poisoned him, and the priest, bound by duty, reported it. Perhaps a rival, jealous of her influence, betrayed her. We do not know exactly how she was caught, but we know what happened next. She was tried, convicted, and executed. The records say she was strangled to death. Then her body was thrown into the convent of Palermo, not as a burial, but as a warning, a message to any other woman who might think she could escape the chains of her marriage through such dark means. But Tofana d'Adamo did not die alone. She left behind a daughter, a young woman who had watched her mother's arrest, who had seen her dragged through the streets, who had learned every secret of the trade before the authorities came. Her name was Giulia, and she had inherited more than her mother's knowledge. She had inherited her mission. After her mother's execution, Giulia Tofana knew she could not stay in Palermo. The authorities would be watching her. The church would suspect her. She was the daughter of a convicted poisoner, and in the eyes of the law, the sins of the mother could easily be passed to the child. So she did what any intelligent woman with dangerous knowledge would do. She disappeared. Giulia fled north to Naples, one of the largest and most chaotic cities in all of Italy. If Palermo was a small stage where everyone knew everyone's secrets, Naples was a sprawling theater of masks and shadows. It was a place where a woman could vanish into the crowd, where a new identity could be built, where the past could be buried beneath layers of lies and reinvention. But Giulia did not come to Naples to hide. She came to perfect her craft. Naples was a city of contradictions. It was a center of art, music, and learning. But it was also a city of crushing poverty, violence, and despair. The streets were filled with beggars and thieves. The rich lived in fortified palaces while the poor fought for scraps. And everywhere, in every corner of society, there were women trapped in marriages that were slowly killing them. Giulia saw opportunity. She began her new life quietly. She rented a small room in a modest part of the city and presented herself as a widow, a respectable woman who sold cosmetics and remedies to other women. She was charming, well-spoken, and careful never to draw too much attention. She attended church. She helped her neighbors. She became a familiar, trusted face. And in the shadows of that trust, she began her mother's work again. But Giulia was not content to simply copy her mother's methods. Tofana had been caught, after all. Her formula, whatever it was, had left some trace, some suspicion. Giulia knew that if she was going to succeed where her mother had failed, she needed to be better, smarter, more invisible. She needed the perfect poison. What Giulia Tofana created in those early years in Naples would become one of the most feared substances in European history. It was a poison so effective, so undetectable, that it would claim hundreds of lives over the next 50 years. And yet, for most of that time, no one even knew it existed. She called it Aqua Tofana, Tofana's water. The formula was deceptively simple, which was part of its genius. It was made from a combination of arsenic, lead, and belladonna, deadly nightshade. Each ingredient was carefully prepared and distilled, then mixed in precise amounts to create a clear, odorless, tasteless liquid. It looked like water. It could be mistaken for holy water, for rose water, for any innocent tonic. But it was death in a bottle. The brilliance of Aqua Tofana was not just in its invisibility, it was in its patience. Giulia understood that a sudden, dramatic death would raise suspicion. Poison that killed in hours would send doctors and investigators searching for foul play. But Aqua Tofana was designed to kill slowly. A single drop would cause nothing, perhaps a slight headache, a moment of nausea, easily dismissed. 2 or 3 drops spread over days would bring a mild fever. The victim would feel weak, tired. He might take to his bed, and the doctors would diagnose a common ailment. They would prescribe rest, perhaps some useless remedy. 4 to 6 drops, carefully administered over weeks, would bring the end. The victim would waste away, growing weaker and weaker. His organs would fail slowly and quietly. He would die what appeared to be a natural death, a sudden illness, a weak heart, the will of God. And the widow, dressed in black and weeping at his bedside, would inherit his fortune. No one would suspect. No one would investigate. The poison left no trace in the body that the primitive medicine of the time could detect. It was the perfect murder weapon, and Giulia Tofana was the only one who knew how to make it. But she did not sell it to just anyone. Giulia was careful, calculating, and deeply aware of the dangers she faced. She developed a system, a network, a kind of secret society of women who understood the code. Giulia Tofana was not just a poisoner. She was an organizer, a strategist, and in her own dark way, a protector of women. She understood that to survive, to truly succeed, she could not work alone. She needed allies. She needed a network of women who would protect her secret, who would spread her product, and who would ensure that no one, no man, no priest, no official, would ever trace the deaths back to her. And so, she built her coven. It began with the women who came to her directly, the desperate wives who knocked on her door in the dead of night. Giulia would listen to their stories. She would assess them, not just for their desperation, but for their intelligence, their discretion, their ability to keep a secret. If she trusted them, she would give them the poison, but she would also give them something else, a warning and a promise. The warning was simple. Speak of this to no one. Not your sister, not your mother, not your priest. If you are discovered, I cannot protect you. You will face the law alone. The promise was just as simple. If you succeed, if you are free, and if you encounter another woman in need, you will know where to send her. And so, the network grew. A widow in Naples would whisper to a friend in Rome. A woman in Rome would tell her cousin in Florence. Each new member of the network was carefully vetted, carefully trusted. They did not know Giulia's real name. They did not know where she lived. They knew only that there was a woman somewhere who could help. The network had its own language, its own codes. A woman seeking the poison would not ask for it directly. She would speak of a sick relative who needed ease from suffering. She would mention Saint Nicholas, the patron saint of the dying, or she would ask for manna, the bread from heaven. The sellers, the women who distributed Aqua Tofana on Giulia's behalf, would understand immediately. These distributors were often widows themselves, women who had used the poison, who had gained their freedom, and who now helped others do the same. They sold Aqua Tofana, disguised as cosmetics, as holy water, as medicine. They kept it in beautiful bottles decorated with saints and angels, objects that no man would ever think to question. And they were protected by the greatest shield of all, the silence of women who had everything to lose. This was not just a criminal enterprise, it was a revolution hidden in plain sight. In a world where women had no legal power, no right to divorce, no protection from violent husbands, Giulia Tofana had given them the only power they could wield. The power to end their suffering, the power to choose. But power, even the power to survive, always comes at a cost. For years, the network operated in perfect secrecy. Husbands died, widows mourned, inheritances were claimed, and no one suspected a thing. Giulia Tofana grew wealthy, not from greed, but from necessity. Each bottle she sold brought her gold, and that gold allowed her to live independently, to move freely, to stay one step ahead of suspicion. But in the shadows of Naples, Rome, and beyond, the deaths were adding up. Dozens of men, then hundreds, all dying of mysterious illnesses that baffled the doctors. And while each individual death seemed natural, unremarkable, when you stepped back and looked at the pattern, a terrifying question began to emerge. Why were so many husbands dying? And why were their widows always so calm, so prepared, so quick to move on with their new fortunes? Whispers began to spread, not loud accusations, but quiet suspicions. A priest here, a physician there, a grieving son who did not believe his father's death was an act of God. The authorities were not yet listening, but they would be soon. The network had been perfect. The poison had been invisible. But nothing stays hidden forever. And when the light finally shone on Giulia Tofana's empire of death, the revelation would send shockwaves through all of Italy. The question was not if she would be discovered. The question was, how many more would die before she was? Rome, 1659. The eternal city, the seat of the Pope, the heart of Christendom, a place of marble churches and golden relics, where pilgrims came to seek salvation and where the powerful came to broker deals with God and kings. But beneath the surface of holiness, there was something strange happening, something the priests and physicians could not explain. Men were dying, not in war, not in plagues, though plague was common enough. These deaths were different. They were quiet, unremarkable. A merchant would complain of headaches and take to his bed. A nobleman would develop a fever that the doctors could not cure. A banker would grow weak, his skin turning pale, his body wasting away over weeks or months. The physicians would diagnose it as bad humors, as a weakness of the heart, as the mysterious will of God. And then the man would die. What made these deaths unusual was not the deaths themselves. Death was a constant companion in the 17th century. What was unusual was what came after. The widows did not weep for long. In a time when a widow was expected to mourn for a year, to dress in black and withdraw from society, to live in quiet sorrow, these widows seemed different. They mourned, yes. They attended the funerals, they said the prayers. But within weeks, sometimes days, they would emerge from their grief with a strange kind of energy. They would take control of their late husband's businesses. They would sell properties, claim inheritances, move to new homes. Some would remarry quickly, but this time to men of their own choosing, men who treated them with respect. Others would choose not to remarry at all, living as independent women, a rarity in a world where women were expected to be under the authority of a man. The priests noticed, the families of the dead men noticed, and they began to whisper a question that no one wanted to say aloud. Were these women too calm, too prepared, two, relieved. But suspicion without proof is just gossip. And in a city as large as Rome, gossip is everywhere and means nothing. The deaths continued. The widows multiplied. And Giulia Tofana, working quietly in the shadows, grew bolder. She had moved to Rome years earlier, following the network she had built. Naples had become too familiar, too dangerous. Rome was bigger, more anonymous, and filled with women who needed her help. She no longer worked alone from a single room. She had established a base of operations, a place that was both brilliant and blasphemous in its audacity. She worked from a church. It was the Church of Santa Maria in Portico, a modest but respected place of worship in the heart of Rome. Giulia had become a familiar face there, a pious widow who attended Mass every morning, who donated generously, who helped organize charity for the poor. The priests loved her. The congregation admired her. She was the picture of Christian virtue. But Giulia understood something that most people did not. The church was not just a place of worship. It was a place of sanctuary. In the 17th century, churches held a sacred power. If a criminal fled into a church and claimed sanctuary, the civil authorities could not arrest them there. It was considered holy ground, untouchable by the laws of men. Only the church itself could hand over a criminal to the secular authorities, and they rarely did. The church protected its own. Giulia used this to her advantage. She set up a small room within the church, a place where women could come to pray or seek guidance. In reality, it was her workshop, her sales floor, her headquarters. Women would arrive under the guise of seeking spiritual counsel. They would kneel in the pews, cross themselves, and whisper their sins to the woman they believed could grant them absolution. But the absolution Giulia offered did not come from God. It came in a bottle. She would meet them in the small room, away from prying eyes. She would listen to their stories, tales of abuse, of cruelty, of husbands who beat them, who spent their money on mistresses, who threatened to kill them if they ever spoke of leaving. And Giulia, with the calm patience of a priest hearing confession, would offer them the same solution she had offered hundreds of women before. "Manna di San Nicola," she would say, holding up the delicate bottle, "a blessing for those who suffer." The women would take the bottle, slip it into their robes, and leave the church with their heads bowed in prayer. To anyone watching, they were simply faithful women seeking comfort from God. No one suspected that they were leaving with murder in their hands. This arrangement was perfect for Giulia. If the authorities ever came looking for her, she could claim sanctuary. If anyone accused her, she could point to her piety, her charity, her devotion to the church. And the network of women, the hundreds who had bought her poison and used it successfully, would never betray her. They had too much to lose. For years, it worked flawlessly. Giulia Tofana was untouchable, protected by the church, shielded by the silence of desperate women, and invisible to the eyes of the law. But she was not invisible to everyone. Dr. Domenico Caetani was a man of science in an age when science was still half magic, half prayer. He was a physician to some of Rome's wealthiest families, a man who had studied at the great universities, and who prided himself on his ability to diagnose and cure ailments that baffled lesser doctors. But lately, he had been baffled too. Over the past few years, he had been called to the bedsides of a troubling number of men, merchants, nobles, bankers, all suffering from the same mysterious illness. It began with headaches and nausea. Then came fever and weakness. The patients would waste away. their bodies growing thinner, their skin turning a sickly pale. He had tried every remedy he knew, bloodletting, purgatives, herbal tonics, but nothing worked. The men always died. At first, he attributed it to bad air, to an imbalance of humors, to the will of God. But as the deaths mounted, he began to notice a pattern. All of the men were married. All of them had been healthy before the illness struck. And in almost every case, the wife had seemed strangely calm, not hysterical with grief, as one might expect, but composed, almost businesslike in her preparations for widowhood. One case in particular haunted him. A nobleman, a man in his 40s, robust and strong, had fallen ill after returning from a trip abroad. His wife had called Dr. Caetani to attend to him. The doctor examined the man and found nothing that would explain the sudden decline. He prescribed rest and a special diet. But the wife, he noticed, insisted on preparing all of her husband's meals herself. She would not let the servants touch his food or drink. "I must care for him myself," she said, her eyes downcast in wifely devotion. "It is my duty." The man died 2 weeks later. Dr. Caetani attended the funeral, and as he watched the widow accept condolences, he saw something in her eyes that chilled him. Not grief, not sorrow, relief. A quiet, profound relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. He began to ask questions, quietly, discreetly. He spoke to other physicians, and they too had noticed the strange pattern. Men dying of mysterious wasting illnesses, wives who seemed too prepared, widows who moved on too quickly. But questions without answers are just suspicions. And Dr. Caetani knew that accusing a noblewoman of murder based on a feeling would destroy his reputation and likely get him sued, imprisoned, or worse. He needed proof. He needed to understand how these men were dying, and that meant he needed a body. The opportunity came when a wealthy banker died under the same mysterious circumstances. The man's adult son, suspicious of his stepmother and her sudden eagerness to claim the inheritance, demanded an autopsy. It was a rare request in those days. Cutting open a body was considered a desecration, a sin against God. But the son was powerful, and he insisted. Dr. Caetani was called to perform the examination. He worked in the cold stone basement of a church, the body laid out on a wooden table. The smell of death filled the room, but Caetani ignored it, focusing instead on the body before him. He opened the chest cavity and examined the organs. The heart, the lungs, the liver, all showed signs of failure, but not from disease. It was as if the body had simply stopped working. Then he examined the stomach and intestines, and there, in the lining of the stomach, he found something strange. Small, dark lesions, areas where the tissue had been burned or corroded. It was not the work of disease. It was the work of something foreign, something toxic, poison. The word hung in the air like a ghost. Dr. Caetani stood over the body, his mind racing. This was not a natural death. This was murder. And if this man had been poisoned, how many others had died the same way? He wrote his findings in a careful, detailed report. He did not name the widow directly. He had no proof that she was the one who administered the poison, but he made it clear. This man had been killed, slowly and deliberately, by a substance that left almost no trace. The report was sent to the authorities, and for the first time, the invisible plague had a name: poison. The authorities in Rome, now armed with Dr. Caetani's findings, began to investigate. But investigating poison in the 17th century was nearly impossible. There were no forensic labs, no chemical tests. The poison left almost no trace, and the women who used it were protected by silence. The break in the case came not from brilliant detective work, but from fear and guilt. A woman named Giulia Tofana lay dying in her bed, her body ravaged by a fever that no doctor could cure. She was one of Giulia Tofana's most trusted distributors, a widow who had sold Aqua Tofana to dozens of women over the years. She had grown wealthy from it, but now, as death approached, her conscience began to break. In the Catholic faith, a deathbed confession was sacred. It was the final chance to unburden the soul before facing God's judgment. And Giulia Tofana, terrified of what awaited her in the afterlife, called for a priest. The priest arrived, expecting the usual confessions of minor sins, vanity, gossip, perhaps a lie or two. What he heard instead was a horror beyond his imagination. Giulia, her voice weak and trembling, confessed to her role in the network. She spoke of the poison, of the women who bought it, of the hundreds of men who had died. She named names, described methods, revealed the entire operation, and at the center of it all, she named the architect of the invisible plague, Giulia Tofana. The priest, bound by the seal of confession, could not directly report what he had heard to the authorities, but he could and did urge the woman to confess publicly, to seek earthly justice as well as divine forgiveness. And Giulia, knowing her death was imminent, agreed. She gave a formal statement to the authorities, and with her dying breath, she tore down the walls of silence that had protected Giulia for decades. The hunt was on. The authorities moved quickly. Armed with Giulia Tofana's confession, they began arresting members of the network. Women were dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. Bottles of holy water were seized and examined. The connection was undeniable, and every arrested woman, under the threat of torture, pointed to the same source, Giulia Tofana. The soldiers came for her in the church of Santa Maria in Portico. They surrounded the building, blocking every exit. The lead officer walked to the altar and demanded that the priests hand her over. But Giulia was already there, kneeling in prayer before the cross, her hands folded, her face serene. She looked up at the officer and spoke calmly. "I claim sanctuary," she said. "This is the house of God. You have no authority here." The officer hesitated. She was right. The law of sanctuary was absolute. If the church refused to surrender her, the civil authorities could not enter. The standoff could last for days, weeks, even months. But Giulia had made one miscalculation. She had assumed that the church, which had protected her for so long, would continue to do so. The priest, the same one who had heard Giulia's confession, stepped forward. He looked at Giulia, this woman he had believed to be a pious servant of God, and he saw her now for what she truly was, a monster hiding behind a holy mask. He turned to the officer and spoke the words that would seal her fate. "Take her," he said. "God offers sanctuary to sinners, but not to the devil himself." The soldiers moved forward. Giulia Tofana, the Poison Priestess, the woman who had killed 600 men and walked free for decades, was finally in chains. But the question remained, what would they find when they searched her workshop? How many more bottles of death were still out there, waiting to claim their victims? And how many women, even now, were adding drops of Aqua Tofana to their husband's wine, unaware that their secret weapon had just been revealed. The cell was cold and dark, lit only by a single torch burning in the corridor outside. Giulia Tofana sat on a stone bench, her hands bound, her fine clothes now torn and dirty, but her face, even in the flickering shadows, remained calm, almost serene. The authorities had taken her from the church and brought her to the prisons beneath the Palazzo del Governatore, the seat of papal justice in Rome. This was not a place for ordinary criminals. This was where the church dealt with heretics, witches, and enemies of God. And Giulia Tofana, they now believed, was all three. The interrogator who entered her cell was a man named Cardinal Orsini, a high-ranking official of the papal courts. He was not a brute who would scream and threaten. He was an intellectual, a man who believed that the truth could be extracted through reason, through careful questioning, through the slow breaking of the will. He sat across from her, a small wooden table between them, and placed a document on the surface. It was Girolamo Spara's confession, the proof of her guilt. "Giulia Tofana," he began, his voice soft but firm, "you stand accused of the murder of over 600 men. You are accused of heresy, of witchcraft, of conspiring with the devil himself to bring death into the homes of Christian families. What do you say to these charges?" Giulia looked at him with dark, intelligent eyes. She did not flinch. She did not weep. She simply spoke, her voice as calm as if she were discussing the weather. "I have killed no one," she said. "I am a simple widow. I sell cosmetics and remedies to women. If some of those women used my products in ways I did not intend, how is that my crime?" It was a clever defense. She was trying to distance herself from the murders, to claim ignorance, to suggest that she was merely a seller of goods with no control over how they were used. Cardinal Orsini was not impressed. "Do not insult my intelligence," he said, his voice hardening. "We have the testimony of dozens of women. We have the bottles, the receipts, the letters. We know what Aqua Tofana is. We know what it does. And we know that you are the one who created it." Giulia said nothing. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. The cardinal leaned forward. "Tell me," he said, "did you feel nothing for these men? Did you not think of their families, their children, their souls?" For the first time, something flickered in Giulia's eyes. Not guilt, not remorse, something else, something colder. "Did their families think of the women they were destroying?" she asked quietly. "Did they care when those men beat their wives, when they stole their dowries, when they threatened to kill them?" "I gave those women what the law would not. I gave them freedom." The cardinal sat back, stunned. It was a confession, but not the kind he expected. She was not denying her crimes. She was justifying them. "You speak of freedom," he said slowly, "but you delivered death." "I delivered choice," Giulia replied, "in a world where women have none." The interrogation continued for hours, but Giulia would say no more. She had made her position clear. She did not see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as a liberator, and no amount of questioning would change that. Cardinal Orsini left the cell and returned to his superiors with a grim report. Giulia Tofana would not confess. She would not repent. And if they wanted the full truth, if they wanted the names of every woman in her network, every victim, every detail, they would have to use the church's final tool of persuasion: torture. The torture chamber beneath the papal prisons was a place designed to break the human spirit. It was a room of stone and iron, filled with instruments whose very names invoked terror: the rack, the strappado, the wheel. But the church, in its twisted mercy, had rules for torture. It was called the question, and it was presented not as cruelty, but as a path to truth, a way to save the soul by forcing the body to confess. Giulia was brought into the chamber in chains. The torturers, men in dark robes who performed their work with the cold efficiency of clerks, explained what would happen. They gave her one final chance to confess fully, to name every accomplice, to reveal every detail of her network. She remained silent. They began with the strappado. It was a cruel but simple device. Her hands were bound behind her back, and a rope was attached to her wrists. The rope was thrown over a beam in the ceiling, and she was lifted into the air, her entire body weight hanging from her shoulders. The pain was immediate and excruciating. Shoulders dislocated, muscles tore, and the agony was so complete that most people confessed within minutes. But Giulia Tofana was not most people. She hung there, her face twisted in pain, sweat pouring down her face. The torturers waited, listening for the words they wanted to hear. But when she finally spoke, it was not a confession. "You want names," she gasped, her voice tight with pain. "You want to know who bought my poison? Look to your own palaces. Look to the wives of cardinals and nobles. Look to the women who kneel in your churches and pray with your priests. They are everywhere, and you will never find them all." It was defiance, even in agony. The torturers lowered her to the ground and gave her a moment to breathe, to reconsider. But Giulia knew something they did not. She knew that even if she gave them every name, even if she betrayed every woman who had ever bought Aqua Tofana, it would not save her. She was already condemned. The only question was how many others she would take with her. The torture continued. They used other methods, each more brutal than the last. And slowly, piece by piece, Giulia began to speak. Not because her will was broken, but because she had made a calculation. She would give them enough to satisfy their need for justice, but not so much that it would destroy the entire network. She named the women who were already dead, like Girolamo Spara. She named those who had already been arrested. She gave them the victims they already knew about. But the living, the women who had successfully escaped their tormentors and were now living in freedom, those names she kept locked in her mind, buried where no amount of pain could reach them. It was a final act of protection, a final act of loyalty to the cause she had served for so long. After hours of interrogation and torture, the authorities had what they needed, not the full truth, but enough. Enough to justify the trial, enough to pronounce sentence, enough to make an example of her that would echo through the centuries. The trial of Giulia Tofana was held in July of 1659 in the Great Hall of the Papal Court. It was not a quiet affair. Word of the Poison Priestess had spread throughout Rome, then throughout Italy, and finally across all of Europe. The woman who had killed 600 men with a bottle had captured the imagination and the horror of an entire continent. The hall was packed. Nobles, clergy, merchants, and common people all crowded in to witness the trial of the century. They wanted to see the monster with their own eyes. They wanted to understand how a woman, a mere woman, could have wielded such terrible power for so long. Giulia was led into the hall in chains, flanked by guards. She was no longer the composed, elegant woman who had once moved through Rome's churches like a saint. Her body bore the marks of torture. Her clothes were rags, but her eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, were still sharp, still defiant. The charges were read aloud: murder, heresy, conspiracy, witchcraft. The list went on and on, each accusation more damning than the last. The prosecutor, a skilled orator, painted a picture of Giulia as a servant of the devil, a woman who had sold her soul for gold and power. He described the victims, the husbands, the fathers, the sons who had died mysterious deaths. He held up bottles of Aqua Tofana, showing the court the innocent appearance of the poison, the angelic imagery on the glass meant to deceive. "This woman," he declared, his voice ringing through the hall, "has committed crimes so terrible, so vast in their scope, that they rival the plagues of Egypt. She has turned wives into widows, children into orphans, and homes into tombs. She has made a mockery of the sanctity of marriage and the will of God." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces twisted with anger and disgust. Then it was Giulia's turn to speak. She was not granted a defense attorney. She was expected to defend herself. She stood before the court, her chains rattling, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and unwavering. "I am guilty of the charges," she said simply. The crowd gasped. A confession, freely given, was rare. Most defendants fought to the bitter end, denying everything, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. But Giulia was not finished. "I am guilty of giving women a choice," she continued. "I am guilty of providing freedom to those who had none. The law calls it murder. I call it mercy. You speak of the sanctity of marriage, but where was that sanctity when husbands beat their wives? Where was God's protection when women were property, to be used and discarded? I did not create the evil in those homes. I only gave women the power to end it." The crowd erupted. Some shouted in outrage, calling her a demon, a witch. Others, mostly women, their voices quieter but no less passionate, murmured in something that sounded almost like agreement. The judge, a cardinal dressed in scarlet robes, slammed his gavel down, demanding silence. "Giulia Tofana," he said, his voice cold and final. "You have confessed to crimes against God and man. You have shown no remorse, no repentance. You have twisted the sacred gift of knowledge into a weapon of death. The sentence of this court is clear." The hall fell silent. Everyone knew what was coming, but they wanted to hear it spoken aloud. "You are sentenced to death," the cardinal declared. "You will be executed in the public square so that all may witness the fate of those who defy God's law. May your soul find the mercy in death that you denied to so many in life." The crowd roared with approval. The guards grabbed Giulia's arms and began to drag her from the hall. But as she was led away, she turned back one final time and spoke, her voice cutting through the noise. "You think my death will end this?" she called out. "The poison is already out there, in 100 homes, in 1,000 bottles. You cannot stop what has already begun." And with that, she was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the corridor, leaving behind a courtroom full of people who suddenly felt much less safe in their own homes. The execution was set for 3 days later in the Piazza di Ponte Sant'Angelo, a public square near the Vatican. A large wooden platform was constructed, and in the center, a noose was prepared. This was to be a public hanging, a spectacle designed to send a message to anyone who might be tempted to follow in Giulia Tofana's footsteps. On the morning of the execution, the square filled with thousands of people. Nobles watched from balconies. Merchants and shopkeepers closed their businesses to attend. Mothers brought their children, using the event as a lesson in the consequences of sin. And in the crowd, hidden among the faces, were the women, the widows, the wives, the daughters who had bought Aqua Tofana and used it to claim their freedom. They watched in silence, their faces betraying nothing. Giulia was led onto the platform, her hands bound, her head held high. The executioner read the charges one final time, and a priest approached, offering her a crucifix and one last chance to repent. She looked at the priest, and for a moment, something softened in her expression. Not regret for her crimes, but perhaps a weariness, a readiness for the suffering to end. "I have lived as I believed was right," she said quietly. "Now I will die the same way." The priest stepped back, shaking his head in sorrow. The executioner placed the noose around her neck, and then, in the final moment before the lever was pulled, Giulia Tofana did something unexpected. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces, and she smiled. It was not a smile of madness or defiance. It was a smile of knowing, a smile that said, "I see you, I know who you are, and my work will live on." The lever was pulled, the platform dropped, and Giulia Tofana, the Poison Priestess, the woman who had killed 600 men with a bottle, died in the sunlight before a crowd of thousands. But her death was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a legend. In the days and weeks that followed Giulia's execution, the authorities continued their investigation. They raided homes, seized bottles, arrested women. They were determined to eradicate every trace of Aqua Tofana, to destroy the network completely. But they discovered something troubling. The poison was everywhere. They found bottles in the homes of noble women and servant girls. They found it in convents, hidden among the medicine stores of nuns. They found recipes copied in secret journals, passed from mother to daughter. Some women, fearing discovery, threw their bottles into the Tiber River. Others buried them in their gardens, and some, defiant to the end, kept them hidden, waiting for the day when they might need them again. The authorities realized a horrifying truth. Giulia Tofana had not been exaggerating in her final words. Her death would not end the plague of poison. It was already too deep, too widespread, too ingrained in the desperate survival strategies of women who had no other recourse. And so, the question that haunted the authorities, that whispered through the courts and churches of Rome, was this: how many more men would die before the last bottle of Aqua Tofana was finally destroyed? How many more widows would smile in secret, knowing they held in their hands the power to end their suffering? And perhaps most terrifying of all, in the homes of the judges and cardinals who had condemned Giulia Tofana, in the palaces of the nobles who had cheered at her execution, were there wives and daughters who had already purchased their own small bottles of holy water. The monster was dead, but the poison lived on. The execution of Giulia Tofana did not bring peace to Italy. Instead, it unleashed a wave of paranoia that swept through the country like wildfire. The authorities, now fully aware of the scope of Aqua Tofana's distribution, launched an aggressive campaign to root out every remaining trace of the poison. But in their fear and fury, they did something far more dangerous. They stopped looking for evidence and started looking for suspects. And in the 17th century, when a woman was suspected of anything dark or unnatural, the accusation alone was often enough to condemn her. The witch hunts began. Women across Italy, especially widows, especially those who had inherited wealth from their late husbands, especially those who lived independently or practiced any form of healing or herbalism, were rounded up and questioned. The methods were brutal. Torture was common. Confessions were extracted under agony, and those confessions, whether true or fabricated under pain, led to more arrests, more accusations, more deaths. In Rome alone, over a dozen women were executed in the months following Giulia's death. Some were genuine members of her network. Others were simply unlucky, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or denounced by jealous neighbors, or greedy relatives who wanted to claim their property. The irony was bitter. These women, many of whom had used Aqua Tofana to escape male violence, were now being destroyed by male authority. The very system that had trapped them in abusive marriages was now hunting them for daring to escape. But the authorities, for all their brutality, could never quite stamp out the legend. Because the more they searched, the more they realized that Giulia Tofana had done something unprecedented. She had not just killed individuals. She had created a culture, a movement, an idea that could not be executed or buried. The idea that women did not have to endure, that they could fight back, that power, even in its darkest form, was still power. In the years that followed, despite the executions and the fear, women continued to seek out Aqua Tofana, or their own versions of it. Across Europe, poisonings that matched the pattern of Tofana's method began to appear. In France, a massive scandal known as the Affair of the Poisons erupted in the 1670s, just decades after Giulia's death. It involved noblewomen, fortune-tellers, and alchemists who sold poisons and love potions to the wives of powerful men. At the center of it all was a woman named Catherine de Chaise, known as La Voisin, who operated a network eerily similar to Giulia's. The scandal reached all the way to the court of King Louis XIV, and dozens were executed before it was finally suppressed. In Spain, in Germany, in Poland, stories emerged of mysterious widows and sudden deaths, of women who seemed to know too much about herbs and remedies, of bottles labeled with saints' names that held something far darker than holy water. And always, in the whispered conversations, in the secret meetings between desperate women, the name Tofana was invoked like a prayer or a curse. The recipe for Aqua Tofana, though never officially recorded, was passed down through oral tradition, through coded letters, through the unbreakable bonds of women who understood that survival sometimes required terrible choices. Giulia Tofana had become more than a person. She had become a symbol, and symbols, unlike people, cannot be killed. As the decades passed and the hysteria faded, the story of Giulia Tofana began to shift from scandal to legend. And with that shift came a question that still haunts us today. Was Giulia Tofana a monster or a hero? The answer, like most truths, is not simple. On one hand, the facts are undeniable. She created a poison. She sold it to women. Those women used it to kill their husbands. Over 600 men died, possibly more. These were murders, premeditated and deliberate. And no matter the justification, no matter the circumstances, the taking of a human life is a profound moral transgression. But on the other hand, the context cannot be ignored. The women who came to Giulia were not casual killers. They were desperate. They lived in a world where they had no legal rights, no protection from abuse, no ability to divorce or escape. If a husband beat his wife, the law did nothing. If he stole her dowry, she had no recourse. If he raped her, it was considered his right as a husband. The church, the state, the society, all of them told women to endure, to suffer in silence, to accept their fate as the will of God. Giulia Tofana offered them a different option. Not justice, perhaps, but freedom. And for many of these women, freedom was worth any price. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the story. Giulia's crimes were made possible by a society that offered women no legitimate path to safety. She filled a void that law and morality refused to address. She was a symptom of a sick system, even as she was also a perpetrator of terrible acts. So, what do we call her? A vigilante, a serial killer, a dark feminist icon, a demon, a saint? Perhaps she was all of these things. Perhaps she was none of them. Perhaps the only honest answer is this. Giulia Tofana was a woman who saw suffering and offered a solution, and that solution was poison. Whether that makes her a hero or a monster depends on which side of the bottle you were standing on. The story of Giulia Tofana did not die with her. It lived on, transforming over the centuries into legend, into myth, into cautionary tale, and dark inspiration. In the 18th and 19th centuries, her story was used as a warning to women about the dangers of independence and the sin of defying natural order. She was portrayed as a witch, a temptress, a servant of Satan who lured good Christian women into damnation. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, the narrative began to shift again. Feminist scholars rediscovered her story and saw in it something different. A tale of resistance, of women fighting back against an oppressive system in the only way available to them. Giulia Tofana became a dark icon of female empowerment, a reminder that women have always found ways to resist, even when the cost was terrible. Her poison, Aqua Tofana, has appeared in countless works of fiction, novels, plays, television shows. She has been referenced in discussions of women's history, of the history of crime, of the long and complicated relationship between poison and power. And the question she represents, the question of how far is too far, of whether violence in self-defense or in pursuit of freedom can ever be justified, remains as relevant today as it was in the 17th century. Giulia Tofana killed 600 men, but she also freed 600 women. And in the space between those two facts lies a moral complexity that we are still trying to understand. But there is one final mystery, one last secret that Giulia Tofana took to her grave. The formula for Aqua Tofana was never written down. Despite the arrests, the trials, the executions, no official record of the exact recipe was ever found. The authorities seized bottles. They analyzed the contents as best they could with the primitive science of the time, but the precise combination of ingredients, the exact process of distillation, the secret that made it so perfect, so invisible, so deadly, that knowledge died with Giulia. Or did it? Because even today, centuries later, in the dusty archives of old libraries, in the secret journals of alchemists and poisoners, in the whispered traditions of folk medicine, people still search for it. Historians, chemists, true crime enthusiasts, all trying to unlock the secret of the poison that changed history. And every so often, a story will surface. A mysterious death, unexplained by modern medicine. A widow who seems just a little too calm, a little too prepared. A case where the symptoms match those described in the old testimonies. The headaches, the weakness, the slow, wasting decline. And people will wonder, could it be? Could the formula have survived? Could Aqua Tofana, the poison of the Poison Priestess, still be out there, hidden in a bottle, waiting to be used? We will never know for certain. But in the shadows of that uncertainty, the legend of Giulia Tofana lives on. A reminder that some secrets are too powerful to die, and some weapons, once created, can never truly be destroyed. In the end, Giulia Tofana's story is one that refuses to be simplified. She cannot be reduced to a single label, a single judgment. She was a criminal and a liberator, a murderer and a savior, a monster and a hero. She was all of these things, and the truth of her life exists in the tension between them. What we know for certain is this. In an age when women had no voice, no power, no way to escape the bonds that held them, Giulia Tofana gave them a weapon. And with that weapon, they changed their lives, their fates, their futures. 600 men died, 600 women were freed, and the world, in its own way, was never quite the same. The legacy of the Poison Priestess is written not in law books or history texts, but in the quiet revolutions that happen behind closed doors, in the desperate choices made by those with no other options, in the eternal struggle between power and powerlessness. So, what do you believe? Was Giulia Tofana history's most successful female serial killer? Or was she a dark angel of mercy, offering freedom to the enslaved? Was she a monster who deserved her fate? Or was she a product of a monstrous society that left women no other choice? The answer, perhaps, depends on whether you see the bottle as half empty or half full, as poison or as medicine, as death or as liberation. We want to hear your thoughts. What do you believe happened in those homes? Were the women who used Aqua Tofana victims or villains? And in a world where the law offered no protection, was Giulia Tofana's solution justified? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you found this journey into the shadows of history as compelling as we did, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We explore the dark corners of the past, the forgotten stories, the mysteries that have been buried by time. Click the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Thank you for walking with us through this dark chapter of history. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous weapons are often the ones we cannot see. This has been the Midnight Archives.